everything changed basically one night. It was a Halloween night, actually, when she was my girlfriend at the time, but my wife now. We were waiting in line in Deep Ellum and waiting in line for a sorority fraternity party on Halloween night. A guy was sharing Christ with the girl in front of us, and I had really never seen evangelism. I'd really never seen someone really in a winsome, loving way be challenged to come to Christ. But he never talked to us. You should always share the gospel really loud. I had I think he probably knew I was eavesdropping. I was listening because I was right behind her. And we ended up going in. It just struck me in the heart, that conversation that I overheard. And as I look back on it, I wouldn't be able to say this in the moment, but as I look back on it, I see this as the calling. Romans 8, 29 and 30, those whom he foreknew, predestined, he called. And the calling for me was that moment. That's when I believe through him, that guy, I was hearing Jesus say, "Follow me." Trivin Mettinger wrote a book called The Riddle of the Resurrection. It's considered the kind of the foundational book, the definitive book on the history of dying and rising gods and all that. But listen to what he says about Jesus. He says, "There is, as far as I'm aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. While studied with profit against the background of Jewish resurrection belief, the faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. The riddle remains." That's how he ends the book.
First Peter 3:15 says, "But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account of the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence." Are we ready to give a defense to our neighbors? This is Apologetics Profile, a podcast ministry of Watchman Fellowship Incorporated, equipping and preparing the body of Christ to defend the faith with reason, gentleness, and confidence. Here is your host, staff apologist Daniel Ray.
Science writer Marcia Bartusiak, in her 2009 book, The Day We Discovered the Universe, tells a stunning tale of the tectonic history of the Diablo mountain range located along the California coastline, presenting her readers with a vista as literally breathtaking as the physical view from its summit, as if nature herself was setting the stage for man to make discoveries about the universe. The section is worth reading at length. Quote, "An immense continent of rock, known as the North American Plate, slid inexorably over an oceanic slab of Earth's crust, moving eastward. At the tectonic juncture where the two gargantuan plates smashed together, the ocean floor plunged downward, the tremendous compression forging massive blocks of shale and sandstone. In due course, some of this material lifted upwards from its depth, relentlessly rising toward the sky to form the Diablo mountain range, 200 miles of peaks and vales stretching from the San Francisco Bay southward along California's coastline. As if readying for a performance, nature sculpted the landscape that, millions of years later, offered astronomers a unique observing platform for their studies of the cosmos. Situated on the eastern edge of the Pacific, this lofty terrain became the perfect vantage point from which to make the first great discoveries in the 20th century astronomy." End quote. Bartusiak continues and describes how one particular peak got its name from a former Presbyterian minister. Quote, "One noticeable peak in the Diablo Range, some 40 miles from the sea, was known to early settlers as La Sierra de Isabel. The first to record an ascent to its uppermost reaches were William Brewer, a geologist who worked on California's first complete geological survey, and Charles Hoffman, a topographer. Laurentine Hamilton, then a Presbyterian minister from San Jose, tagged along for the 1861 summertime adventure. While journeying over the lower elevations, the men used mules but struggled over the last 3 miles on foot. With the 2 scientists burdened down by their heavy equipment, the minister was able to sprint ahead, pushing through the chaparral, mesquite, and thick groves of scrub oak that filled the mountain's furrowed sides like well-sprinkled seasoning. Upon reaching the summit, Hamilton waved his hat in the air and exclaimed, "First on top, for this is the highest point." In honor of the achievement, Brewer graciously named the peak after his noble and true friend. End quote. Mount Hamilton would soon become home to the largest refracting telescope in the world at the time. The 36-inch mirror first saw the light of the cosmos in January of 1888. Its sheer size gave astronomers unprecedented vistas into the cosmos that would soon inspire and set the stage for an even larger telescope that would come to rest high atop the San Gabriel Mountains of Southern California at the Mount Wilson Observatory. Mount Wilson became center stage for the remarkable discovery that our universe was much larger than anyone had previously imagined. In the early 20th century, the debate raged over whether or not spiral nebulae were mere clouds in our own Milky Way galaxy, or if they were actually distant worlds, island universes unto themselves, akin to our own galaxy. Much to the surprise, shock, and dismay of many, Edwin Hubble, high atop Mount Wilson's peak, using careful observations he had collected using the 100-inch Hooker telescope, the main mirror of which was manufactured by a French company that made wine bottles, settled the question once and for all. Andromeda was no mere cloud within the Milky Way. It, too, was a galaxy, much like our own. Hubble later showed his photographic plates to the English poet Edith Sitwell, whose first reaction was, quote, "How terrifying," end quote. In 1609, upon another stage, the immortal dialogues of Shakespeare's Hamlet were first debuted, as prescient and apt a description for the ghostly images of distant worlds discovered high atop Mount Wilson in the 1920s. "O day and night, but this is wondrous strange," says Horatio to his friend Hamlet, upon seeing the ghost of Hamlet's father in Act 1, Scene 5. To which the venerable melancholy physic Hamlet retorts, quote, "And therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome. Here are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in our philosophy." End quote. It is difficult to imagine the collective societal shock Hubble's discovery caused. Not only was Andromeda a galaxy like our own, but the universe was littered with galaxies. And not only that, but according to what Hubble had been observing, these galaxies were flying away from us at unimaginable speeds, indirectly implying the universe must have had a beginning, an idea that astrophysicist Sir Arthur Eddington found repugnant. The late astronomer Robert Jastrow, himself an agnostic, put the point rather bluntly, quote, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." Within just a few decades, we learned the universe was far larger than had ever been previously imagined. Mount Hamilton and Mount Wilson became the bedrock peaks which enabled us to gaze into the magnificence and splendor of the universe. We had seen the glory of God and the reality of the physical universe that stretched the minds and the imaginations of philosophers, scientists, poets, and priests. It was a discovery that contained tinctures of the revelation of God's glory atop another mountain some 2,000 years ago. It was not a telescope, however, but a roughly hewn wooden cross, bearing upon it the Creator of the universe, its base sunk into the earth atop the rocky outcropping of Golgotha, just outside the city of Jerusalem. The cross gave mankind a portrait of a philosophy about the heavens and the earth no one had ever considered. The one who fashioned Andromeda and the untold multitude of stars and galaxies in the heavens came down to us in the body of a man, a servant who washed our feet, who fed us, clothed us, and healed us of our diseases. The fingers that gave light to the diadems of the cosmos touched our eyes and opened them to the reality of his love. As the late physicist Freeman Dyson said, quote, "The more I examine the universe and study the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe, in some sense, must have known we were coming." Of course, the universe did not know we were coming, but the one who created it certainly did. But we hated him and had him put to death on a cross. Yet death was not finally the end, only a portal. It was the resurrection of the Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, who the first Christians identified as Lord and Yahweh of the Hebrew Scriptures. And it is the resurrection of the Son of God from the dead that continues to be the centerpiece of human civilization. No matter what one may say of Jesus or of the plausibility of someone returning from the dead, the truth of the matter is that there is nearly a unanimous consensus among scholars and historians that the first Christians truly believed their rabbi was once dead but had returned from death in a glorified and resurrected living body. This episode of Apologetics Profile features part one of my conversation with professor, theologian, and author Dr. Justin Bass, whose new book, The Bedrock of Christianity, provides a rich but very accessible look at the undeniable historical record of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. Dr. Bass focuses his research on what he considers to be unambiguous, a virtually unanimous consensus on what history has left us with regarding this remarkable event. Justin and I talk a bit about his experiences, what inspired him to write the book, and his own personal testimony in coming to know the risen Jesus, and how the historical facts pointing to Jesus rising from the dead are the best explanation for the origin and bedrock of the Christian faith. Dr. Justin Bass.
Blessed to be here in the States. I'm usually in Amman, Jordan right now. I've been there for the last 3 years. It's called Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary, JETS for short.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the largest evangelical seminary in the Middle East. So I've been teaching there for the last 3 years and also serving an NGO, helping refugees, Syrian, Iraqi, and some Yemeni, actually, with all the horrific things happening in Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
Getting refugees in Jordan from Yemen as well. And I've been serving a number of churches there. And I've been writing. So this book that I have that just came out in April, The Bedrock of Christianity. I've been working on it for years, but the main writing happened probably right as we moved and into the first 2 years of being there in Jordan.
You have pastored a church here before you went to the Middle East for a couple of years in the Plano area. And I know I have attended a couple of your services while you were here before you left. And you have debated Bart Ehrman. You have given several talks, I don't know how many, one or two, at the Bible and Beer Consortium here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Well, you know what's really cool about that is that I actually gave the inaugural talk for the BBC in Dallas. So I was the first one they ever did in Deep Ellum.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was kind of cool. It was the very first one. I think they had done some in Fort Worth, but the first one they did in Dallas, I did. And you know, Bo Bishop
Yes.
He did. I think he did the next one, but I did the first one, and it was pretty cool because my testimony is actually connected with Deep Ellum, so it's kind of cool. I was proclaiming Christ there at that bar in Deep Ellum when I was going to bars, and that's how I came to Christ back in college. But
well, I know I attended one with your conversation with Dan Barker. That was a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago. You were still here, but I remember the story you telling me about you and Dan going out to dinner, and the waitress thought you were the atheist and Dan was the pastor.
Yep. That's exactly right. Young guy is the atheist.
Right. But we say all this to say that, Justin, you've had a wide range of life experience in bars and in academic circles, and now in the Middle East for several years. You have a wide-ranging scope of experience in talking to people about Jesus. And so this book, The Bedrock of Christianity, has your blood in it. You're not just armchair philosophizing. You are getting down to the brass tacks of what makes Christianity unique. And you've road tested this yourself.
Yeah, I've even joked that, I really wrote the book primarily to myself because, the case that I bring about the resurrection is really what is most persuasive to me. And really, again, my conversion story is connected with definitely not just geographically connected with Deep Ellum, but philosophically and theologically and historically, it's connected in every way with the resurrection. So the evidence for the resurrection has been something I've been focusing on from the very beginning. When I first picked up, probably Lee Strobel's Case for Christ was probably one of the first things I read, and Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis was one of the earliest books I read in college. Those are some of the earliest introductions I had to kind of an apologetic approach to the faith. But I came across N.T. Wright very soon after that because I was dealing with some of the most intelligent arguments against Christianity, and specifically against miracles and against the resurrection and against the Bible being the Word of God when I was at SMU. So I was, when I came to Christ, I was at SMU. It was despite SMU. It wasn't because of SMU. SMU really was a godless culture and campus. And I was godless as I went there, so I was a part of it. But if those who are listening don't know, SMU is Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And I went there to get a business degree, and I was on my way to go get a law degree, and that was my whole plan. I was obsessed with especially making money. I had a lawn service. I was doing really well with the lawn service at the time, and everything changed basically one night. It was a Halloween night, actually, when she was my girlfriend at the time, but my wife now. We were waiting in line in Deep Ellum, and waiting in line for a sorority fraternity party on Halloween night. This was 2001, actually. And a guy was sharing Christ with the girl in front of us, and I had really never seen evangelism. I'd really never seen someone really in a winsome, loving way be challenged to come to Christ. And he was also sharing specifically about her going in there and getting drunk and everything. And this wasn't a good example for Christ. I think she claimed to be a Christian, the person in front of us, but he never talked to us, which is still funny to this day. He never actually spoke to me or Allison. And so I was joking, you should always share the gospel really loud, because you don't know who's actually listening. You don't know who you're actually talking to.
Right.
This guy had I think he probably knew I was eavesdropping. I was listening because I was right behind her. He was right there. And he ended up leaving. He left the line because she rejected him and went in the club. And we ended up going in, and we got in a fight, though. My girlfriend, wife, and I got in a fight because she wanted to stay and I was ready to leave. It just struck me in the heart, that conversation that I overheard. And as I look back on it, I wouldn't be able to say this in the moment, but as I look back on it, I see this as the calling. Romans 8, 29 and 30, those whom he foreknew, predestined, he called. And the calling for me was that moment. That's when I believe through him, that guy, I was hearing Jesus say, "Follow me." And so everything changed for me after that. I started reading the Bible for the first time. We finished the Bible in about 6 months and got obsessed with theology and philosophy and just Christian apologetics. And going back to SMU, how that was such a big deal for me was I was taking classes religious studies classes with this professor who I later found out was a disciple of Bart Ehrman. I did not know that at the time.
Oh.
In fact, I'd never even heard of Bart Ehrman at the time. But Mark Chansey, he's now, I think, the head of the religious studies department at SMU. But he was one of their very charismatic, and he's an excellent professor. But he is brilliant at giving a very eloquent and studied and interesting lecture that completely demolishes any type of second grade level, third grade level Christianity, which of course most of the students coming into SMU that were claiming to be Christian, that's pretty much what they had.
Yeah.
No more than second or third grade level Christianity.
Right.
And I was just beginning, but because of him challenging things as he was doing, it got me into these books. Like I found N.T. Wright, I found a great Catholic New Testament scholar named Luke Timothy Johnson. I found a lot of solid scholars that were giving the best of the best, I would say, arguments against what he was bringing, which he really was bringing the Bart Ehrman level arguments against Christianity in that class. So I'm in a way thankful to him because he introduced me early on. He's the reason I got into the historical Jesus studies and the powerful evidence of the resurrection so early.
Yeah.
But it was interesting when I found out later that he was a disciple of Bart Ehrman.
Wow. Well,
he studied under him.
That brings me to basically the gist of your book, which is so impressive because what you do in a short couple of 100 pages, I mean, is out there in spades in terms of, well, there's a lot of literature on the resurrection and who Jesus is, of course.
Yes.
But if you've been in this field for any length of time, apologetics, Christianity, you know that the books on the resurrection and who Jesus is, from Larry Hurtado to N.T. Wright to Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, and many others that I can't even name. The literature is endless, but you seem to have been able to successfully condense down in a couple of 100 very meaty pages. This is a great introduction to what I would call the Hall of Fame of resurrection literature. I don't know how you did it justice. But you really have. I mean, it's obviously you've thought about this both experientially and academically and pastorally, and it really resonates. The text really resonates. But let's begin with the centerpiece of the resurrection, the earliest bit of textual evidence that we have in Scripture. It is the centerpiece of the book. It is the centerpiece it's the earliest attestation to the resurrection that we have on paper, if you will, the creed of 1 Corinthians 15. Do you want to unpack that a little bit? Why is this early? Why is this important? Why do people always talk about 1 Corinthians 15? What's going on in that text?
Yeah, it's really just fascinating. I think the more you study it, as I've experienced, it's just bottomless. It's just inexhaustible. What we have, really all of Scripture is that way. But when I think about 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 specifically, this is what scholars call a creedal tradition or a traditional formula, something that basically was pre the writing of 1 Corinthians itself. So this is something that Paul actually received, and this goes back to those early years in Jerusalem, soon after Paul actually became a Christian. When Jesus appeared to him on the Damascus Road, very soon after that, he tells us in Galatians that he went to Jerusalem. In fact, he tells us 3 years after that, he went to Jerusalem and met with Peter and spent 15 days with Peter. He was his house guest, hanging out with them. Probably went fishing, probably did a lot of cool things, probably went and saw the holy spots led by Peter himself.
Right. You point out briefly, you pointed out in when you just mentioning Galatians brought this to mind, you point out a very interesting word in Galatians 8 that appears nowhere else in the New Testament. And this has everything to do with when he met with Peter. What's that word? What's special about it?
That's right. Yeah. 118, he says, most English translations have, it just says he met with Peter, or he sought him out, but the actual Greek word is only used there in the entire New Testament, used very commonly in other Greek writers, but it's the word hystereo, which is where we get the word history. So really, it's a word that means, to seek out for information. Herodotus uses it when he talks about his journeys to seek out historical information for his enterprise, as he's, known as the father of history, the first to kind of do follow the kind of more, at least an ancient historical method. So most would agree that when, Paul uses that word specifically because he's saying, when I went to meet with Peter, I didn't just, I love that, I'm meeting with Peter, the rock of the church, Jesus' chief disciple, but it really wasn't about him per se. It was about what he could teach me. It was about what he could tell me about the historical Jesus that has now, in his glorified, risen form, has appeared to me and completely shocked me, knocked me off my horse, probably literally,
right?
And, turned my world upside down. So I want to know everything I can learn about this Jesus. And I think we then get a lot of information about Jesus in Paul's letters that he probably got originally from Peter. And also in the very next verse, Galatians 1:19, he mentions that he also spent time with James, the brother of Jesus. So two very, very important eyewitnesses. In fact, Bart Ehrman says in his book, Did Jesus Exist? He talks about that. And he says, you can't get closer to a historical person than this. I mean, this is his own brother.
Yeah.
Other than Jesus actually writing something, you can't get closer to him.
So in the ancient Near East,
his disciple and his brother.
Right. The thing that impressed me most about your book in relation to the text we're talking about here, 1 Corinthians 15, is just the kind of exceptionally good history you just mentioned, Bart Ehrman. The kind of exceptionally good history this is, not only just from that time period, but really from any point in the past. This kind of documentation, the number of manuscripts, the similitude between all the extant manuscripts, the earliest copies of the manuscripts, and then just exactly the kind of you do an excellent job of outlining the chronological proximity of what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 15 to what he experienced to when Jesus resurrected. We're talking about 20 years, maybe, right?
Yeah, I would say, 20 years would be the number for Paul writing 1 Corinthians. But when we're talking about these traditions, like 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, but like I mentioned, other statements that Paul's making about what he did, we're talking about that first decade after Jesus's resurrection. So we're talking about the 30s AD. We're talking about, even atheist scholars would put the meeting of Peter and Paul, that 15 days he spent with him in Jerusalem, around 37. We're talking 37, 38, 36. There's a give or take a year on most of these chronologies, but we can do it pretty accurately within a year or so. We can get a lot of Paul's missionary journeys and Paul's travels and movements, especially in those early decades. And so we're talking 30. If it's 37 AD, which is the date I use in my book, we're talking, within 5 years of Jesus's actual death and resurrection. If he was crucified in 33, he might have been crucified in 30, but so we're talking about 7 years if he was crucified in 30. But scholars debate whether it's 30 or 33. But either way, we're talking less than a decade of Jesus's death and resurrection. Paul is meeting with these earliest followers and receiving this information that he writes and puts in his letters that he wrote about 20 years after this, because 1 Corinthians would be dated to around 53, 54 AD. So really incredible. You're exactly right. I mean, and when we're not just talking about what everyone agrees is solid history, but I mean, when you compare it, it's just laughable when you compare this kind of solid historical information going back to within 5 to 10 years of a historical figure. I mean, it's just virtually unparalleled.
Right. I mean, most of the audience that we have are familiar with the field of apologetics, but you do hear often the comparison between the remnant documentation from antiquity we have about Roman leaders, playwrights, or philosophers, from the time they lived to the time they wrote to the actual earliest manuscript we have in existence. And we're talking centuries, gaps of centuries. With the Gospels and the New Testament, there's not even a comparison to there's two important dates. There's like, how long after did the Apostle Paul write down these things from the events that occurred? And then the other fascinating aspect of this is manuscript evidence, the earliest manuscripts that we have.
When do we have the first manuscript that shows up in history as well?
That's amazing.
Those are two separate issues that in both cases, the New Testament just is superior. Far and above, superior than anything in the ancient world.
Now, Justin, I know you know that there's a lot of literature on the resurrection. Mike Licona, Gary Habermas, N.T. Wright. You cite a lot of these people in your book. I loved your book because it was compact, and I think it's a great first step into the world of resurrection literature. But what was the unique approach? I want you to explain a little bit about the unique approach of your book and what you were after that adds a voice and a service to the bedrock of resurrection literature. What's unique about the bedrock of Christianity and your approach to examining the historical nature of the resurrection?
Yeah, I try to argue right at the beginning in the introduction, as you saw, I mentioned how I think, there are many excellent books that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to especially resurrection literature. You mentioned some: Mike Licona, N.T. Wright, William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas. There's some, giants that have gone before me and written excellent books. But many of them, some of those I specifically mentioned, like Licona's and N.T. Wright's, we're talking 600, 700 and so pages, and dealing with such a wide swath of the literature, the debates on the Gospels, on Paul, on views on the resurrection, on so many different things. And so what I wanted to do with this book is really just whittle it all down to just the things that are completely common ground, that are indisputable facts that everyone agrees on. Mm-hmm. And so the only way to really do that would be to focus on Paul's early letters. So if you just focus on Paul's early letters and you focus on these traditions, like the 1 Corinthians 15 tradition that talks about Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and then his appearances, if you just focus on those, you're dealing with territory that, whether it's Bart Ehrman, whether it's Rudolf Bultmann, whether it's going back 200, 250 years to some of the first more skeptical scholars that kind of launched historical criticism of the Bible and different things, we're talking about complete agreement. I mean, I use 99% because of, there's always some on the internet that are going to say anything. There's always Holocaust deniers. There's always moon landing deniers. And so there's always someone that'll deny anything. But as far as the scholars who have really gone through this and vetted these things over really a 250 year or so period, since historical criticism has began, they've agreed that Paul wrote those early letters, that the historical information he's relaying in those letters are predominantly accurate. I don't know any specific things that Paul would say historically in those letters that they would deny. And then also, as we said, the specific claims about Jesus's death, Jesus's resurrection, not that he actually resurrected, but that they believed he resurrected, and that they believed that he appeared to them. And then I bring in also this, the undeniable fact, obviously, that the indestructible movement has gone on to overtake the world. It began in Jerusalem, and it's gone on to be the largest religion in the world. But just on that aspect, on the unique aspect, I think this is the one book that I know of where you can get just the facts that all the scholars across the field, whether Jew, atheist, agnostic, liberal, conservative, even Muslims. I mean, it's fascinating. Even in the Quran, the crucifixion of Jesus, which is clearly a bedrock fact, is denied. But even Muslim scholars who delve into this world, like Reza Aslan, for example, he wrote a book on Jesus about a decade ago, and he even admits he claims to be Muslim, but he admits that Jesus was crucified. That's what the history says. I don't care if the Quran says he was not crucified. He was crucified because the historical sources are indisputable. So these are such bedrock facts that even someone will go against their own faith to affirm them. So that's one unique aspect. And another one would be what I mentioned, which is really my fourth key bedrock fact when it comes to the resurrection, that I think demonstrates the truth of the resurrection, which is really the advancement and the influence of this movement, really the beginning of the movement, but then on into the centuries of turning the Roman Empire upside down, turning the Western world upside down, and still to this day is now dominating in the East. I mean, we're seeing the Christian movement dominating in China. We're seeing it in South Korea. We're seeing it in Africa. We're seeing it in Latin America. I mean, this movement, as Gamaliel said so long ago, whether he knew it or not, is truly a movement that if you fight against it, you're fighting against God. And I think that also demonstrates the truth of the resurrection. This to me is strong evidence that with all this smoke of this movement, there was a fire that began in Jerusalem, and that fire would be the resurrection.
Right. If you don't mind, I wanted to read the creed that we're talking about here from the NASB, 1 Corinthians 15. It says, Paul says, "Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which also you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as it were, to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." Now, I think it's wonderful in the context of even who Paul is writing to. The Corinthians were like a brand new, like the First Baptist Church of Vegas, and they were just a bunch of people that were just coming out of a sinful lifestyle and trying to figure out what this Jesus thing was all about. And so Paul is gingerly, paternally writing to this church that's having all kinds of internal problems. And here in the midst of all of these problems is the earliest attestation of the most wonderful event in human history. Isn't that to me is amazing.
It is amazing. I like the parallel, Rome, the Romans he wrote to, they were, that was Manhattan. That was New York City, and the Alexandrian churches. That was L.A. Corinth would be Vegas, definitely Vegas.
Absolutely, with everything going on there.
And you see that in the letter when Paul's, the things he's dealing with. But notice also he's saying, I'm reminding you. So he's already taught them this. This shows that this was something that I think was probably just it's a creedal type formula. Probably a memorizable early catechesis that was used by the apostles, not just Paul, but that he got from Peter. But when Peter went and planted churches, as he did as well, and all the apostles, as they went out and planted churches, they probably taught the new converts this, as we see Paul did with the Corinthians. So he would have planted this church around 49-50 AD. Mm-hmm. And so when he did that, the first thing he taught them, what would be the bedrock of their faith? He would have taught them. Here's how you know Jesus died for your sins. He rose from the dead. And look at all these people that he appeared to, including me.
Absolutely. And in the first verse of 15, I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you. This is not the first time that the Corinthians have heard this creedal statement, that Paul was here, as you say, in Corinth before. But I love what you say. You have some wonderful quotes in the beginning of your chapters, and one of the ones you have is on page 111. It's from C.S. Lewis and his book Miracles. I just want to read it. It says, "The New Testament writers speak as if Christ's achievement in rising from the dead was the first event of its kind in the whole history of the universe. He is the first fruits, the pioneer of life. He has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the beginning of the new creation. A new chapter in cosmic history has opened." And then you begin that chapter 5, the resurrection. He was raised on the third day, with a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien. And the Lord of the...
Let me just say something on that Lewis quote too, because something that was amazing to me. I read Miracles a long time ago, soon after I came to Christ in college. Mere Christianity, was one of the first books I mentioned that I read, and Miracles I read very soon after that. But I reread Miracles as I was preparing for this book, and I was amazed that Lewis, just as you heard in that quote, but all throughout his discussion, especially about the resurrection, he is really already saying all the great things that N.T. Wright has really been championing about, that we don't just, resurrection isn't just about going to heaven when we die. This isn't what the New Testament is focused on. The New Testament is focused on new creation. that something new in the entire cosmos has taken place. That's going to one day happen to the entire cosmos. This is what happened in the resurrection.
Yes,
it's
right.
Just amazing. Lewis, who is not a New Testament scholar, he is already saying what I think is one of the most important things that need to be taught on the resurrection.
Absolutely. Well, that was the point I wanted to have you expand upon. Exactly what the objection you often hear is the resurrection. In fact, I just got a list from somebody the other day on Twitter. Here's all the things that are like the resurrection in pagan antiquity, and they list all these myths and of dying and rising gods and all these kinds of things. Yeah. But you really unpack this idea that the resurrection, and as the Lewis quote alludes to, is not like anything in the ancient world. It doesn't even come close. It's not even remotely related to Horus or to Dionysus, or there's no vagaries about this. There's no mythical ambiguity about this. This thing struck people to the core of their being as absolutely incredible. Nothing like it. Nobody saw it coming. Even the disciples were laughing at the women when they told them that Jesus was alive. So can you sort of...
And to back that up with some strong scholarship, I actually have it right with me. Trivin Mettinger wrote a book called The Riddle of the Resurrection. It's considered the kind of the foundational book, the definitive book on the history of dying and rising gods and all that in the ancient world.
Excellent.
And let me read you this quote from him, because he has a section on Jesus's resurrection after he discusses what he really classifies as only pre-Jesus. He actually classifies only 3 technical, what he thinks are this dying and rising God idea, this cycle that would have been a part of these seasonal changes that people believed in. Osiris was
one
of the 3. But listen to what he says about Jesus. He says, "There is, as far as I'm aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. While studied with profit against the background of Jewish resurrection belief, the faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. The riddle remains." That's how he ends the book.
Wow.
Pretty incredible. I mean, this is the top, I don't even know if he believes in the resurrection, but he is the top scholar in the field on that. And he says, Jesus' resurrection is absolutely unique. And he actually gives reasons for that, multiple examples of why Jesus' resurrection is completely different from...
I was just reading some background information about the Old Testament view of Sheol. And what was a refreshing reminder to me, and also something relatively new. You always learn, you think you know something, and then you reread it and you're like, oh, I thought I knew something, but now I really don't. But it was really interesting how Dr. Walton nuanced the idea that in the Hebrew scriptures, there was some sort of general sense of an afterlife, but nothing like a bodily resurrection from the dead. There was some anticipatory hints, if you want to look at them that way, but the bottom line was this bodily resurrection was not something that, I mean, you had the Pharisees who believed in an afterlife, the Sadducees, or a resurrection. The Sadducees did not. There was this division in Jesus' day, but this idea of a body coming back in this world in this time was unprecedented in anybody's mind. Correct?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely true when you think about an individual. I do think Daniel 12 is very specific, but and most that I've read, I think they would agree that's where you get, because many of these scholars would argue Daniel was actually not written by Daniel, but comes from the second century after the Maccabees. So that's why they would say, oh yeah, Daniel's definitely talking about physical resurrection. But I think it was written by Daniel in 5th century, maybe 6th century actually, BC, probably from Persia. And so we're getting bodily resurrection going back all the way there. But he says those who sleep in the dust will rise, and some will go to everlasting shame and contempt, and some will shine like the stars forever and ever.
Yeah, that's Daniel 12, 2 and 3.
That's right. And so you have this double idea of resurrection of the wicked and the righteous, and that would happen when Michael, does his work. That's what's said in chapter 12, verse 1. So there's this great tribulation, and then there's this resurrection, but no one believed that an individual, let alone the Messiah, would rise again, like he was talking about in the middle of history. This is what is absolutely unique among what the Christians claim, the early followers of Jesus. What they were saying in the 30s AD is truly unparalleled in the history of ideas.
Yeah, it really is. And it's hard to, as Christians in the West, we're used to this idea of resurrection and Easter, and we dress up and take it for granted and forget. It's wonderful. Your book was a wonderful reminder to me of how unique, how exclusive, how radical, how life-changing the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth was and is and remains. You in such a short book, you've accomplished three things. You show how stark it was, how stark it is, and how stark it will continue to be for generations to come. We are still talking about
2,000 years later,
the centrality of the man from Nazareth, the man of sorrows, acquainted with.
He's still trending on Twitter. He's
still trending on Twitter, right?
You cannot stop trending.
It's remarkable. Of course, we here at Watchmen are dedicated to understanding other non-Christian religions, worldviews, and cults. And one of the central aspects of the different ideas that we deal with on a regular basis, it oftentimes you see it always going back to these groups having something to say about Jesus. And to me, that's just another affirmation of the centrality of Jesus's life and work.
That's right. They can't get away. They can't get away from him. They have to either distort him in some way, but they can't get away from him. I mean,
that's right. It is absolutely
Islam.
That's right.
As C.S. Lewis said, is really the greatest heresy, most significant heresy of Christianity. I mean, for the longest time, after Islam grew up and the Christians started noticing them in the early church fathers, beginning with John of Damascus, that's what they called it from the very beginning. They called it a Christian heresy. So they had no idea it would go on to become this world religion, but they looked at it like we look at Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses. It was just a Christian heresy because they had their own views about the Bible. They had their own views about Jesus. So it's very similar to what we see in the cult-like movements today. And it just happens to be that with Islam, it's dominated. It's become a world religion through its advancement with armies and the sword. But that's the only difference. If Mormons took up a sword and were more powerful, I'm sure they would have more territory than Utah. But it's always interesting. People think of it kind of as this unique, different religion from the East, but really it's really just a Christian heresy.
This concludes part one of my conversation with Dr. Justin Bass on his book, The Bedrock of Christianity. Next week on part two, Justin and I get into more of the details of his research about the historicity and scholarship behind the resurrection of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. We'll see you next week.
This episode of Apologetics Profile has been a production of Watchman Fellowship Incorporated, Arlington, Texas. For more information on this and any of our other podcast episodes or resources, visit watchman.org today. For Watchman Fellowship, I'm Dave Mitchell.